Hello, everyone. Welcome to our peer learning session, Exploring Collaborative Health, Resilience, and Governance. This session is part of a series of peer learning sessions hosted by the National Forest Foundation. I'll refer to that as NFF throughout today's session in partnership with the Forest Service's Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, which I'll also refer to as CFLRP. My name is Sally Bernstein. I'm the Conservation Connect Program Manager for the NFF. My program, the Conservation Connect program, fosters and supports collaborative forest stewardship efforts, working in close partnership with the Forest Service, as well as many partners and communities all over the country. I'd also like to acknowledge my colleague, Jane Mandala. She will be your tech guru today. Jane has been awesome. She's the driver of our planning and logistics for today's session, and she's available to help should anything come up. Please send her a chat and she'll do her best to help you out. So as I go through our overview, our introductions, please feel free to say hello to everyone, introduce yourself in the chat. Why don't we put your name, your organization, and location. So as we all know, collaboration plays a critical role in many forest management efforts, particularly those that span large landscapes where there's complex challenges, multiple parties, landowners, and many different values. Today's objectives are to share program level findings from the Collaborative Governance Assessment administered to CFLRP programs by the Southwest Ecological Restoration Institute, or SWERI, discuss assessment outcomes, including CFLRP, collaborative health, function, resilience, and outcomes of collaborative work, and finally learn from projects that are working to make project level assessments actionable. So briefly for the agenda, we'll be exploring collaborative health, resilience, and governance. We'll first hear from our CFLRP partners. I'll pass the mic to Bryce, who'll provide a little bit of context, and then we'll head into breakout rooms so you get to know who's in the room. We'll break into groups of roughly 4. You'll take a moment to introduce yourself, to talk a little bit about your experience working in a collaborative or with a collaborative. And then Jane will share with us a link to Slido. That's what we'll be using to capture the word cloud. We're hoping that each of you can include 2 to 3 key ingredients for collaborative success, but you're welcome to include as many words as you'd like. When we return from breakouts, we'll hear from our partners at SWERI. They'll present their findings from collaborative assessments they conducted on CFLRP collaborative groups. And we'll then hear from 2 CFLRP projects from the Rogue Basin and the Zuni Mountains, and hear how their recommendations have resonated with those folks. Finally, we'll end with Q&A. So we have not built Q&A into either practitioner reflections or the presentation. You're welcome to, as questions come up, put those in the chat and we'll add them to the queue, and we'll do a collective Q&A at the end of today's session. So briefly, I'd like to just give an overview of today's speakers. Lindsay Buchanan and Bryce Ash will join us from the CFLRP program. From the SWERI team, we have Melanie Colavito, Nikki Von Haidman, and Hannah O'Reilly. Our practitioners today will be Eitan Kraslovsky and Belinda Brown. Briefly, I just wanted to introduce the NFF as well for those of you who are not familiar with our organization. The NFF engages Americans in community-based and national programs to promote the health and enjoyment of the 193 million acre national forest system. In addition, NFF leads programs that support forest conservation, recreation, and that foster creative dialogue and stewardship efforts that create shared conservation solutions. Finally, some just basic housekeeping. We are recording today's session. Everyone registered for the session will receive a link to the recording, as well as any follow-up materials and presentations from today's session. Please put all your questions into the chat box. And also just remember that just be respectful and keep your mic off and video off as long as you can. We'd like to minimize any distractions. Finally, you'll receive a short feedback survey, and we really appreciate if you take a few moments to fill that out. All of your feedback goes towards helping us improve this series to better meet your needs going forward. So with that, let's get started.
Thanks, Sally. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, please let me know if you have any trouble seeing that. Otherwise, I will start. So thanks everyone for joining. My name is Bryce Esch. I'm the National Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, or CFLRP coordinator. And I want to just take a couple minutes to put collaboration in the CFLRP context for you. So CFLRP was created by law in 2009 to encourage collaborative science-based restoration on priority landscapes to support ecological, economic, and social outcomes, reduce wildfire risk, achieve ecological and watershed health, use wood byproducts to benefit economies, and to leverage public and private resources. Really, at its core, the intent of this program is to encourage collaborative approaches for multiple outcomes. So how does the law that established the program define collaboration? Well, it's quite broad, gives us a general framework, and that allows a variety of models. But the law says that collaboration includes multiple interested persons representing diverse interests and is transparent and non-exclusive, or meets the requirements for a resource advisory committee. As a program, we borrow from the 2012 planning rule for a working definition of collaboration, which is a structured manner in which a collection of people with diverse interests share knowledge, ideas, and resources while working together in an inclusive and cooperative manner toward a common purpose. So there's a few other things that the law that established the program says about collaboration. It says that restoration strategies for these projects must be developed and implemented collaboratively, that proposals need to describe the collaborative process, and that process is a factor that's considered by the advisory committee that reviews and recommends CFLRP projects for funding. And then also projects are required to implement a collaborative multi-party monitoring program for 15 years. So what does collaboration look like in practice for the program? Well, we really see a spectrum of formality, governance, and organizational approaches, and there's really no single best approach. So we have collaborative groups that are multi-level structures, and some that are networks of partnerships. Some use governance documents and decision-making rules. There are differing levels of partner and Forest Service engagement. There's differing meeting frequencies, and some groups use facilitation and administrative support while others don't. A little bit about who participates in the program. Since the beginning of CFLRP in 2010, we've had over 720 unique organizations and individuals engaged across our 31 projects. And those partners, by and large, tend to be local and regional organizations and entities, while we also have some national groups involved, for instance, the National Forest Foundation. And this pie chart demonstrates the categories of participants who participated in FY23. And as you can see here, there's a fairly diverse number of interests represented. We've developed some best practices over the years based on lessons learned in the first 14 years of CFLRP implementation. And I won't run through this list bullet by bullet. And I have a feeling we'll touch on some of these themes later in the presentation and discussions. But if you're interested in learning more about those lessons learned, we have a couple of resources available to you. One is the CFLRP resource library that's on our public-facing CFLRP website. And then also we've been working with NFF on collaboration resources for quite a long time, and they have a wonderful reference in their Conservation Connect site. And these slides will be shared with you after today's session, so you'll have access to both these links. So I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Sally.
Thanks, Bryce. All right, so we are going to break into our short breakout rooms and do quick introductions. I hope you had a good breakout session and got to meet someone new, perhaps. Jane we ran into some technical difficulties. I can't speak today. I'm so sorry. With the Slido link in breakout rooms. So Jane's going to send that out in the main chat now. If you can take just a minute, 2 minutes tops to put your 2 to 3 words. What are the ingredients for collaborative success? Let's do that now. Jane, can you put the link in the chat?
Yes, it is in there, the bolded text. I can send it one more time.
Okay. Thank you. I think we're getting bogged down by introductions and messages. So
Gotcha. I'll share my screen here with the results.
thank you. These are great words. And Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, but the bigger the word, the more it's been inputted. Is that correct?
Yep.
That's great. I mean, I think it looks like we're all somewhat on the same level here. A lot of trust, communication. Respect, transparency. And a few from the chat as well. Thanks, everyone. Hopefully, a lot of these words will resonate with you as we hear from our SWRI presentation, as well as reflections from our practitioners. Keep these in mind as we go through the session today and take a temperature check. Were many of the words that you thought of as we completed this exercise, did they resonate throughout the session? Would you have changed some of your words? Do you want to add any? If we have time at the end of today's session, we will return to this. And if not, the link will be active after we send all the materials. And so you're welcome to continue to add to this and see how it grows over time. Thanks, Jane, for sharing that. All right, I'm going to pass this to the SWRI team.
Thanks, Sally. I am going to kick us off and start by sharing my screen. Can I make sure that you are all seeing that?
Looks great, Melanie.
All right, thank you. Yeah, so hi everyone, I'm Melanie Colavito. I'm the Director of Policy and Communications at the Ecological Restoration Institute, which is one of 3 Southwest Ecological Restoration Institutes, or SWRI. And I'm here today with my colleagues, Nikki Von Hedeman and Hannah O'Reilly. And we're going to be presenting on our findings from assessing collaborative health across the CFLRPs. And I want to acknowledge that we have a much bigger team than the 3 of us here today working on this across the SWRIs, and they are all listed out here on the title slide and have been instrumental in making this happen. So for those of you that aren't familiar with SWRI, we were created in 2004 by an act of Congress, the Southwest Forest Health and Wildfire Prevention Act, with a unique mission to serve as a bridge between science and practitioners to make sure that the research that we're doing is relevant and actionable to decision-making with the purpose of restoring forest health and reducing the risk of catastrophic fire. There are currently 3 SWRI institutes, one at Northern Arizona University, the Ecological Restoration Institute. We have one at Colorado State University, which is the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, and then one at New Mexico Highlands University, the New Mexico Forest and Watershed Restoration Institute. And today we're going to cover, these are really the goals for the session. We wanted to circle back and remind everyone why we're here today, but in particular, we're going to review what we were monitoring for the CFLRPs and why, document some of our findings around what is working well and what needs improvement, cover some of the recommendations that we've generated from those findings to help improve the collaborative process and performance, and discuss with the practitioners who have received these, if these results resonate, what sounds like it makes sense, are there things missing, and how might we operationalize these findings from this monitoring work. Okay, so what did we monitor? So Bryce set the stage for CFLRP and the monitoring, and one of the core monitoring indicators for those projects does focus on collaborative health. So the question that the SWRI were asked to address is, how well is CFLRP encouraging an effective and meaningful collaborative approach? This included a series of questions that were focused on the idea of understanding collaborative health, function, and resilience, and then also what are the perceived outcomes of doing that work? So is the collaboration getting us where we want to go, and how is it going on that process of doing that? So we developed a survey instrument, as well as group interviews with projects that were deployed to all of the existing CFLRPs. And those are something that we plan to review and update on a regular basis. So this can be a longitudinal assessment of collaborative health. So for new projects, this is kind of the first round, but we're establishing a baseline. And then when we come back and collect this data in the future, we can see what might have changed. So what are we talking about when we're talking about collaborative governance? And Bryce did a really nice job explaining like, what is collaboration? We're referring to collaborative governance. That is kind of the emphasis on the processes and structures. And as Bryce noted, that the CFLRP has a wide range of types of collaboration, from formal to informal, those with facilitation, those without. So this collaborative governance really refers to all of those processes and structures of working together in that collaborative space. Engaging participants, groups, organizations, people across boundaries to carry out a purpose that we couldn't otherwise accomplish alone. But I think it's important to note that just as ecosystems are always changing and the places that we're examining are always changing, so are collaboratives themselves, and change is a fundamental and recurring aspect. So it's important for us to look at these changes over time, and that's what this assessment is intended to do. So really, again, here's that question: what processes and structures facilitate the evolution, sustainability, and durability of a collaborative group? So as I mentioned, the SWRI were asked to develop an online or a questionnaire to get at this. This was an online confidential questionnaire to provide input to that common monitoring strategy. And the way that we developed it, I'm not going to go into the theory behind the questions and all of that here today, but it was grounded in the findings from the first 10 years of CFLRP. There has been a lot of research on that particular program. So we looked at what had already been learned. We also looked at the social science literature around collaborative health and other questionnaires that have done similar things in order to develop the survey that was administered to the existing CFLRPs. And we did a program-wide assessment. So all of the projects have been surveyed, and then results were provided to those projects specifically with report outs and presentations. This is our first presentation where we've compiled those findings across all of the projects to provide that program-wide assessment. And here's just an example. If you go to that QR code, you can find the report from the Dinky CFLRP. It's just one of many that we have looked at. And so before I pass it to my colleague, Nikki, I just wanted to say that we are going to be doing this over time to help these collaborative groups be healthy, be resilient, and evolve over time. Thanks. And Nikki,
Great.
just tell me when to advance.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Melanie. Great. So my name is Nikki von Hedeman. I am the Human Dimensions Specialist here at the Ecological Restoration Institute, and I'll just be going over the next few slides of our survey results. So what we ended up doing was surveying 15 currently funded CFLRPs. A couple more have been added since then, but we haven't had a chance to survey them yet. So this is but the bulk of the currently funded CFLRPs. We sent out the survey to, we coordinated with points of contact for each project and sent out the survey to any folks that they thought should be receiving the survey, and we were able to get nearly 400 responses. We asked folks who were replying to the survey which kind of group they represented, and over 50% of the respondents were a combination of these non-governmental organizations, 27% respondents, and also the Forest Service was about a quarter of our respondents. We did have some representation from a variety of other groups that you can see listed here, but those were much smaller percentages. We also asked folks what their main motivations were to participate in the CFLRP project. Folks could choose more than one option, but a large majority of respondents thought that they were participating in order to restore forest resiliency. Other common responses were reducing community wildfire risk and increasing restoration pace and scale. And then there's many other reasons to participate as well, but those are kind of the top 3 motivations to participate in the CFLRP project across all these projects. Next slide, please. Great, perfect. And so one of our questions we asked pretty early on in the survey was how collaborative do you feel your CFLRP project is? And overall, a large majority, over 76% of respondents felt that their CFLRP project had been collaborative to very collaborative. And when we asked this question, we also asked, defined collaboration for participants. So what we meant by collaboration was multiple parties coming together, addressing problems that couldn't be achieved by acting alone, including diverse stakeholder interaction throughout the whole process, having venues for open communication and negotiation about values, interests, and appropriate management actions, and also having opportunities for social learning. So we try to have kind of a definition of collaboration grounded in the literature and experience that was pretty broad. And so overall, folks felt like their CFLRP projects were pretty collaborative. Next slide. We also asked a series of questions on principled engagement. I will say that we aren't including all of our responses to all of our questions in the slides here today because that would just make this a little bit too long. But as Melanie mentioned, each project who participated in the survey has been getting a report. They're also available on our websites. And then we're working on a national synthesis of all of our results. So you're welcome to dig into those sources if you'd like to know more information on questions. But we define principled engagement as kind of having the right people involved in the collaborative, having both an iterative and inclusive dialogue, having the ability to determine shared problems, shared strategies to solve those problems, and a shared purpose of the project and the action that folks are taking. And so in the series of graphs that we have here, kind of the more negative responses are in the red, with strongly disagreeing with some of these statements, and yellow are somewhat disagreeing. The green folks are neutral, kind of neither disagreeing or agreeing, and then the blue responses are somewhat and strongly agreeing. So we asked folks if the collaborative process had created a neutral space to openly discuss controversial issues, and over 70% of folks thought, yes, that was true in their case. We also asked if a representative cross-section of individuals who have a stake in the issues are involved in the CFLRP, and 80% said yes. I will note that, based on the different groups who are represented in the survey responses, that maybe some folks weren't answering the survey, and so I think the responses are definitely based on the folks who chose to take it, so some need to think about as well. And we also asked if participants were working together to identify shared interests and concerns, and 85% of folks said yes, that was happening in their CFLRP project. Next slide. Great. We also asked a series of questions on whether collaboration between the CFLRP participants and the Forest Service was meeting respondents' expectations during these various processes. During planning, 66% of folks thought that their expectations had been met. It dropped a bit during implementation, down to 63%, and then monitoring, 64% felt their expectations had been met. Overall, that's a fairly strong majority, but there is a notable minority, especially in the implementation phase, where around 20% of folks thought that their expectations had not been met. And so I think we also gathered some qualitative comments in the survey, and it seemed like there was some dialogue there about how difficult it was for moving from the direction setting and the planning phase into the implementation phase. And some of these projects that have just gotten funded and are really working through that process. So that phase is just a little bit more challenging, and it'll be interesting to see how these responses change over time. Next slide. We also asked a series of questions on shared motivation, which we really see as building trust, mutual understanding, relationships, and having a strong commitment to the collaborative process. So these responses across the cumulative projects were actually quite positive, where a large majority, nearly 85% and higher, really agree that the collaborative process was building mutual respect, was building relationships, and was building trust in each other. And a large majority, 83%, also agree that they trust in their group's ability to achieve some desired outcomes through the CFLRP process. Next slide. And I'll turn it over to Hannah for the next few slides.
Thanks, Nikki. Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah O'Reilly. I'm a research associate at the Colorado Forest Restoration Institute, which is another SWRI institute located at Colorado State University. And I'm going to talk about the final findings that we wanted to highlight today, starting with resources. So this is important because having sufficient amounts of the necessary resources is important for collaborations to accomplish tasks and get work done. They can also support buy-in from participants, and they help participants share resources across the collaborative that they might not have sufficient amounts of on their own. Overall, we found that respondents felt there was sufficient facilitation and technical expertise. A smaller but notable majority also found that there were sufficient funds. However, fewer than 50% of respondents felt that there was sufficient time to get the work done. And I will also note that the qualitative answers kind of tied the lack of funds to time. So these two resources were very much correlated within the qualitative answers. Next slide. We also looked at institutional arrangements, and institutional arrangements can influence the collaborative process through creating processes, protocols, and structures needed to manage collaboration over time. And they should be clearly understood, perceived as fair and equitable, and also include accountability mechanisms. For CFLRPs, the Forest Service plays a large role in how institutional arrangements are organized, which is why questions about transparency and structure pertained to clarity and decision-making, responsiveness, and collaborative feedback, and partner understanding of how Forest Service decisions are made. Overall, a notable majority of respondents found that these aspects of institutional arrangements were working well. Next slide. Accountability is another important aspect of institutional arrangements. Again, a notable majority of respondents agreed that there was accountability among the different collaborative partners, accountability between the Forest Service and the collaborative, and also that protocols were fair and equitable, understood, and used appropriately. However, it is noteworthy that that all of these metrics were below 75%. So there was notable disagreement for some of these metrics as well. Most importantly, or most notably, the understanding of how to inform Forest Service decisions had a disagreement of 21%. There was also disagreement in terms of the Forest Service being clear about their decision-making. And there was also disagreement in terms of accountability between Forest Service and the CFLRP. Next slide. We also, along with the responses looking at these different collaborative dynamics, we asked respondents to answer questions about the disruptions or challenges that their collaborative may have faced that could get in the way of collaborative function. It's worth noting here that the colors are reversed. So red is a significant challenge, orange is moderate challenge. whereas the blue is no challenge and green is minimal. Out of all of the descriptions that we asked respondents about, the most prevalent were personnel turnover, limited agency capacity, biophysical disruptions, financial resources or lack thereof, really, and limited industry capacity. Also, it is worth noting that these disruptions, these survey questions about disruptions, were also reflected in the open-ended answers. So many people spoke in more depth about how these disruptions were actually manifesting. Next slide. Finally, we asked respondents about perceived outcomes for their collaborative, including collaborative process outcomes. And we just wanted to note here that the collaborative process outcomes that seemed to be moving along most rapidly were the enabling of landscape scale planning and enhanced communication. And next slide, I'm now going to turn it back over to Nikki to kind of recap some of these results, and then we'll turn to the recommendations.
Perfect. Thanks so much. So just a quick kind of recap of, we just threw a lot of graphs at you with lots of information, but generally what we perceive as what is working well, it seems like folks thought, excuse me, that overall, a lot of their projects are fairly collaborative. So there was an overall high degree of collaboration. And I will emphasize that these are the cumulative results, and we've written reports for each project, and some of these results really vary by project. So it's very context specific. We also found that overall projects were working toward having a shared purpose. They were working towards having shared interests and shared concerns. There was fairly high agreement that that shared interest concerns existed. There also was high agreement that there was a pretty high commitment to engagement in the collaborative process, and there were high levels of trust. And then, as Hannah mentioned, that some of the collaborative outcomes that are really working well are enhancing landscape level planning and enhancing communication among partners. There are a few areas that we identified as needing improvement. For example, some of the most common limiting resources were having sufficient time to engage in these projects and also funding. And then there were some institutional arrangements that's kind of indicated some breakdown in accountability between the Forest Service and some of the collaboratives. And once again, this varied by project, but particularly in terms of agency decision making, knowing how to give input, feeling like input was being taken into consideration, and particularly in the implementation phase of work. And then there were obviously several disruptions that were pretty common, things like personnel turnover and limited capacity among the agencies in the forest products industry, and then biophysical disruptions such as wildfire and things like that. Next slide. Now, what we have here is a list of 7 recommendations that have emerged from the results of the survey. The first recommendation we include here is that there is a need to include diverse perspectives and interests throughout the collaborative process. Several respondents noted that they were hoping to include more groups in the future work of their collaborative, or they thought they should be more included. This included historically underrepresented groups such as tribes. There was a fairly low response rate. Just under 5% of our respondents were tribal representatives themselves. So, and I know there was a lot of dialogue in some of these conversations we've had with projects about the need to be more inclusive of tribes in the areas in which they were working, also land grant communities. There was also some demonstrated need to include broader interest space such as recreation and fish and wildlife interests. But there are really several factors that determine whether an entity can engage. Are there resources available? Do they have time? Do they have funding? Do they have capacity? Are there varying incentives that are promoting participation or not? I included a quote here below that really emphasizes that sometimes there are some power asymmetries where a larger entity might have a position that is really well funded and dedicated to CFLRP work, and a smaller entity might not have that capacity to bring to the table, although they might have a more, as the quote says, a more intimate relationship with communities and landscapes. So there's challenges there trying to figure out how to promote inclusive participation. So inclusion really needs to be managed based on the local context, on the history of the area and collaborative, and then the needs and objectives of the project. Next slide. Our second recommendation is to really sustain communication and meaningful engagement throughout the entire collaborative process. There needs to be early, I'm sure you all have seen this in the work you've done with collaboratives, but there needs to be early and frequent engagement from direction setting to implementation to monitoring. There should be a documentation of decisions made. There should be building trust and sharing goals and shared understanding around goals. Participants should be able to understand how and when to inform decisions in these various steps. It's really important to continue this throughout the whole process and not just at the beginning or not just at the end, and that there needs to be clear understanding on how decisions are made and why. The quote I included here really emphasizes how there needs to be more open dialogue and kind of more back and forth in their opinion with this particular project they're talking about, rather than just being presented with what's happening, but more dialogue. Next slide, and I'll hand it over.
Hey, thanks, Nikki. So I'm going to take recommendation number 3, which is really about codifying collaborative governance processes. So we recommend that collaborative governance processes be codified through the development of documents like restoration strategies and charters. This can institutionalize accountability between both the collaborative members and the collaboration and the Forest Service in a way that promotes knowledge production and social learning as well. Next slide. Then we also recommended that structured transition strategies be created to help collaboratives navigate different types of disruptions, including new faces that can alter expectations, commitments, capacity to engage, policy changes that shift priorities, and wildfires or other biophysical challenges that divert resources. And that's just a few of the many, many disruptions that might impact a collaborative. And this can help collaboratives harness disruptions to create positive change, since these challenges aren't inherently negative or positive. To successfully execute this recommendation, expectations, commitments, and collaboratively developed documents should be revisited over time to ensure that they continue to meet the needs of the collaboration as it shifts and changes and adapts over time as well. And this quote kind of speaks to that last bullet point where you need to be able to come back to these types of structured strategies and make sure that they stay relevant as the collaboration changes. Next slide. We also recommend that collaboratives provide sufficient resources and capacity, as we've mentioned a few times now. Providing sufficient resources and capacity is a necessary component for collaborative function. As we mentioned above, the most limiting factors were sufficient time and funding. So one way to supplement this is through finding other supplemental funding sources that can support collaborative capacity building and investments. And then these investments should be used for funding third-party facilitators, technical assistance, researchers, as well as leaders to help coordinate activities, manage communication and conflict among participants, and facilitate social learning and collaborative adaptive management processes. Importantly, this type of funding can actually increase time resources by giving the collaborative access to more people who can then, utilize their time to get this work done. So when done well, these types of investments can actually cultivate collaborative resilience as well. And again, this quote speaks to that. Next slide.
All right, I'm going to take us to the end of this. Thanks, Hannah. So recommendation 6 is focused on continuing to promote trust, relationships, and outreach. We've heard a lot already in the findings about the importance of those factors. Those were also some of the words we saw in that word cloud. Trust is always a big one. How do you develop trust? Well, one way that we heard through this research is this idea about developing a culture of collaboration in the Forest Service where agency staff are really given the permission and incentives and resources and also kind of benefit from participation in collaboration. And that includes giving them capacity, direction, and incentives. But this goes for everybody too, in that training and collaboration is an important factor. Learning how to collaborate is key. It's also important to promote in place rather than continuing to see frequent turnover, which can be one of those disruptions. Sometimes it's not a bad thing, but sometimes it can be disruptive. It's also another key factor was hiring partnership liaisons and including collaborative activities and job requirements. All of these things that kind of promote this idea of doing collaboration as part of your job duties. And this quote speaks to that, how sometimes if you're not incentivized to participate in collaboration, it can be just another thing that you have to do. And so creating that culture is key. Okay. And our last recommendation is this idea of monitoring and supporting social learning. So as we've gone over multiple times today, collaboration is a dynamic process. It can be disrupted, much like the places that we're working to restore. So as these collaboratives evolve and change over time, their values may change, the challenges change, the capacities change, and the outcomes that they produce change. So just understanding that change is part of collaboration. And these longitudinal assessments, so the type of work that we're doing here to understand the performance and health of collaboratives, can help to inform that change in a smart and strategic way. And this quote speaks to that too, is also kind of coming back and monitoring both the biophysical outcomes of collaboration as well as those social and economic outcomes. So that was a lot that we just shared. As mentioned by my colleagues, we have a lot more information. We've delivered these results to the projects themselves. If you go to the QR code here, you can find links to all of the final reports. There are some that are still in development. And then there will be a national report forthcoming relatively soon. But our contact information is here for a subset of the team that has worked on this. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us.
Thanks, everyone. That was really interesting. I really loved hearing your presentation. We did have a quick question in the chat from Chelsea, and although I did say we'll have Q&A at the end of this session, I am going to ask it now. So could you explain a little bit more about how time was related to funding and to what extent lack of time was associated with the acceleration of NEPA timelines?
I can speak to the first part of that. I'm not sure about the NEPA aspect. But basically in the qualitative results, the ways that respondents talked about funding as an issue primarily pertained to when that funding showed up for them. So as an example, one CFLRP encountered issues with hiring the staff they needed to do prescribed burns during the time period that they needed to do those prescribed burns in, because the funding came in May rather than January. So that's kind of was repeated again and again as funding not in a sufficient amount and not at the right time was greatly impacting these projects.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. I think we didn't specifically ask about NEPA, so unfortunately we can't address that portion of the question, although that's something interesting to think about.
Thank you. And Chelsea, thank you for sharing the planning to implementation document in the chat as well. Jane, we can collect that and send that out with the post-session materials. That's a really great document to reference. So Jane, do you want to share your screen? And we're going to pass the torch to our practitioners here today. And I will let Eitan introduce himself. Thank you, Eitan, for joining us.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Again, Eitan Kresolevsky with the Forest Stewards Guild. I'm going to talk about the Zuni Mountains CFLR. Want to acknowledge also that there's a lot of great people in the Forest Service with the Forest Stewards Guild and with a host of kind of the collaborative members, some of whom are on the call right now, that have contributed over the long time, the 12 years plus of this project. And as you can see from the map, the Zuni Mountains, named after Zuni Pueblo, which is not shown on the map, that's a little bit to the southwest here, is dominated by Forest Service managed lands and private and state lands. And in addition to that, the whole landscape in west central New Mexico between Grants and Gallup on I-40 is south of I-40 is, has many tribal communities with obviously, longstanding deep ties to the landscape. And they are, engaged actively in the landscape. So with that, I wanted to do a few things. One, there's a lot of history here because we are one of those 2012 projects from the second cohort. And to me, my timeline with the landscape starts earlier than that, in the early 2000s. And then I'll put in the chat a story map that does give a timeline of the project. So I won't go over all of that now. But if you're interested, you can definitely get more of a landscape feel from the story map. It is dominated by ponderosa pine forest, so a perfect candidate for frequent fire restoration. But what's important to note about the landscape is that there was the precursor in New Mexico to CFLR was the Collaborative Forest Restoration Program, which is a New Mexico only program through state and private tribal forestry out of Region 3. And that program was really integral in the early 2000s. There were 9 smaller 3-year CFRP grants in the landscape that really helped set the stage for doing more at a bigger scale and kind of creating readiness for CFLR so that when we were putting the proposal together in 2011, we had, a lot of people primed and ready to sign on to the proposal, develop the strategy together. And I think there was a strong proposal and was funded. And then we also received an extension a couple years ago. So that collaboration groundwork from the, smaller New Mexico specific CFRP program was really important. Then in 2008, with the America Recovery and Reinvestment Act, that was another important moment because it tied together the local mill, which had been slowly tooling up to do work in the woods, with the National Wild Turkey Federation. And that really set the stage for a stewardship agreement, which has been the real economic driver of the forest thinning component of the CFLR. Another really important enabling condition in this picture here on the left is kind of the heart of this, is that the landscape has 2 halves, the Blue Water Project area and the Rio Puerco Project area to the west. What you're seeing in the photograph, the aerial photograph, is the Blue Water Project area. And there's about 25 square miles of ponderosa pine there that has been thinned and burned, which I'm personally really proud of. I think we did good there collectively as a collaborative. But what set the stage for that was, and it kind of enabled the landscape and the collaborative to kind of jump in and be action oriented, was a 2003 environmental impact statement that covered about 50 or 60,000 acres of treatment. And so that EIS was really important. And actually we just, the Forest Stewards Guild just had some staff out on a prescribed burn yesterday with the Forest Service in an area of that EIS that was still being treated. Most of the thinning is done and it's just in a maintenance and prescribed fire phase. So we had that EIS enabling condition. We had a lot of collaboration dating back to 2005 and earlier with a lot of these smaller scale collaborative grants. And the story I'm going to tell now is a really tough moment in about the 6 months before the pandemic. So about winter 2019, there was a Mexican spotted owl injunction. So this is a lawsuit between some environmental groups that actually some of them had been at collaborative meetings of the Zuni Mountains Collaborative, but it was a Region 3 of the Forest Service wide lawsuit. The lawsuit applied to the 5 national forests in New Mexico primarily, and it led to an injunction to stop all work in national forests. There was a kind of a community fieldwood exemption, but for any projects like the Zuni Mountains Collaborative or other forest thinning or prescribed fire projects, there was, put the brakes on all of that. And what kind of happened, and I'll put another link, which is a very brief post about kind of this successful pivot during that time. And as many of you may know, like if your kind of industry partners, your woods operators, your mills, if they all can generate income and have to stop work during an important field season, which for us was wintertime, that business may have to lay off all their employees, may have to shut down. It's just could be a real devastating impact on the landscape. And so what happened was a kind of a success of collaboration and a little bit of luck. So earlier that year in 2019, New Mexico passed, the state legislature in New Mexico passed an act called the Forest and Watershed Restoration Act. We say it FARA here, but yeah, it's state funding, a recurring state funding program to invest in mostly forest thinning operations on private lands. And so this was a brand new funding mechanism, hadn't really been used, and definitely hadn't been used in West Central New Mexico. And then we had the injunction, and we had our collaboration. So we had people that have been working together at this point in 2019 for 15 years. And yes, there had been turnover, and that work together was sometimes difficult and not always rosy, but people had their sleeves up and worked together. And so what happened is that in this emergency situation of the forest injunction, the mill and National Wild Turkey Federation, the Forest Service, members of the collaborative, and a huge role that New Mexico Forestry Division, our state forestry agency, played was to apply that new funding mechanism, the Forest and Watershed Restoration Act funding, to some of those private lands you see on the map here on the right, and very quickly and nimbly moved some forest operations, or actually all the forest operations, onto private lands with willing landowners. And that way, kind of saved the workforce, the in-woods, the truck hauling, and then the mill workforce, kind of saved all of that and that persisted for about, I think, another 10 months, but it was, covered 2 field seasons worth of work until the Mexican spotted owl injunction was lifted. So really important, pivot that kind of enabled things to keep humming along here and, save jobs and save the infrastructure we need to get the work done on the ground. And so that's just kind of the snapshot I wanted to share. And I guess I'll pass it over to Belinda and Marco.
Thank you, Eitan. That was great. Belinda and Marco, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Marco, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you, Sally. I'm Marco Bay, Executive Director of Lomacatsi Restoration Project. We're based in Southwestern Oregon. Belinda?
Belinda Brown. I'm the Tribal Partnerships Director with Lomacatsi Restoration Project.
Great. You want me to start off, Belinda?
Yes, please.
So Belinda's going to focus on the tribal engagement component to the CFLR that we're involved in with the Rogue Basin Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Project. We have some of our colleagues on the line here too. our ecologist, Bill Kuhn, who's instrumental in leading this effort from the assessment and technical side, and the U.S. Forest Service and their partnership. Give a quick overview on the CFLRP, and then we'll shift to the subject matter around tribal engagement and added value with workforce. So our CFLRP, located in southwestern Oregon, it's really anchored on a 20-year strategy called the Rogue Basin Strategy. And I will put that link in the chat for folks to look at. It's operated under multiple records of decision, but this engagement from 2020 to 2030 is our CFLR. We have a 4.6 million acre watershed in the Rogue Basin with very strategically targeted areas on National Forest Systems lands to conduct treatments, and our goal would be to implement about 145,000 acres over that 10-year period, complementing work across all lands, also on BLM lands and private non-industrial lands within the geography. Dry forest condition, a frequent fire system, like a lot of our forests in the West. So really a focus on forest resiliency based on that 20-year strategy, really to reduce the threat of those severe fires, promote climate adaptation, reduce risk to communities, assets, and really with a focus on protecting late successional habitat as well, riparian habitat, and scaling up this effort we've been involved in for many, many years. The CFLRP is an expression of a couple decades of work prior to the CFLRP being implemented. Next slide, please. So these are some of the partners. There's a lot more, but it's organized under the Rogue Forest Partners with four federal agencies, state agencies, and non-government organizations. The Southern Oregon Forest Restoration Collaborative, that I'm fortunate to serve on the board, their product is a Rogue Basin Strategy that has helped with a lot of the underpinnings of this work. You can see on this map a lot of the projects that we're implementing currently in partnership with the Forest Service. Next slide. And that's being conducted under different mechanisms, but a forest-wide stewardship agreement is one of the main tools. There's also Good Neighbor Authority with Oregon Department of Forestry in the forest. There's challenge cost share agreements, participating agreements, different tools that we're getting this work done across the geography. And we're currently in year 3 implementing this work. Next. I think what we really wanted to discuss here today, and I'll turn it over to you, Belinda, is how we're centering a lot of this work through tribal inclusion. And obviously, the Forest Service and our federal partners have a trust responsibility at the government-to-government level. But through our organization, Lomacatsi, we have a tribal partnerships program and a different way of conducting this work through the Intertribal Ecosystem Restoration Partnership. I'll turn it over to you, Belinda.
Right. I had the privilege and honor of working for the Blue Mountain Forest Partners back in 2010, 2011, when the Collaborative Forest Landscape Program was first being rolled out, and really recognized that we needed to outreach and include tribes. Tribes are place-based, and the Forest Service agencies have a federal trust responsibility to tribes that's different from just underserved or underrepresented communities. So in that position as executive director of the Blue Mountain Forest Partners, fast forward to tribal partnerships director with Lomacatsi Restoration Project in 2022, a lot of times the agencies don't have the capacity to do a lot of this work. So they lean on their nonprofit partners, the NGOs, to come alongside to do some of the outreach to the tribal nations that we have in our area so that we can include them. And also in the implementation of the work that we're doing in the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Projects. And shout out, I know Jody Pixley's on here. I met with her in a breakout room, and it's the other CFLRP that Lomacatsi is concurrently working on in the Mid-Klamath watershed and with the Karuk tribe in the driver's seat on that. So we have tribal organizations, tribal governments, tribal community members, tribal traditional leadership that possibly you won't ever see those tribal leaders that we go to and listen to as the elders of our tribe. Possibly we'll never see them on a tribal government council. So there's many people within the tribal regions, within the communities that we outreach and engage in order to get this work done. And again, we go back to that word cloud. Trust, relationship building, communication is really important for all this work. Next.
Belinda, one thing I would, if I could just add, the Forest Service, the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest has been seen a strong need. We have 5 federally recognized tribes that the forest has to consult with, and with ancestral ties and ceded lands, treaty ties to the geography. But the challenge in that engagement work is most of those tribes have forcibly relocated to the north and to the south. So utilizing some of these dollars in agreements to engage a broader tribal community has been really innovative, that the forest has seen that opportunity to work with organizations like Lomacotsi and the Intertribal Ecosystem Restoration Partnership. Just today, where we have 25 tribal members on the ground with BLM as part of a Rogue Basin Treks putting fire on the ground. And we've done the same with the Forest Service. So that's another innovative way to be inclusive in tribal engagement. Back to you, Belinda.
Yeah, thank you for that, Marco. And again, this work that is being implemented on the ground, healing the land, is also healing our tribal nations, tribal people. As Marco said, there was forcible removal back in the late 1800s. There was a disconnect between the people and the land. 150 years of fire exclusion has not really set us up for good circumstances today. It's why we're seeing some of the catastrophic fires that we're seeing, whole towns being burned to the ground. Our people were removed. Our people are and continue to be the first best stewards of the land. And this is a marriage between Western science and indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, putting people back on the land, using fire as a land management tool, and continuing to care for the earth in the way that we should. So bringing that spiritual component back into it too as added value as we integrate the indigenous traditional ecological knowledge back into these large landscape project initiatives, we're seeing the success. We're seeing the success, socioeconomic success of people having family wage jobs in their own communities. It's been said lately that our people feel like they're trespassers on their own land. And so through CFLRP and through these collaborative projects, we're able to bring people together, again, building trust, relationship. And this is added value in the legislation of the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, Public Law 11111, the 2009 Land Management Omnibus Act. Workforce training and development has been part of it. So we currently have crews from the Oregon Conservation Corps. We've recently signed on to a multi-regional Region 5 and 6 Indian Youth Service Corps that helps us train, equip, and empower 18 to 30-year-old up to 35 if they're veterans in an on-ramp camp for a natural resource career pathway. So within our training program, everybody's trained in first aid, CPR, the incident command system, chainsaw certified, cultural monitor certified, wildland fire certified, and we're working at getting the wilderness first responder and the community emergency response team certification. We're also in the accreditation process for the core network. We've been a 21st century partner with the Forest Service since 2012, and workforce training is important to Lomacotsi's goals, making sure that the first best stewards are out there continuing to work on the land and be successful contributing members of their community. So CFLRP is a good program, and Marco, I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, and we'll finish up here. I think the other capacity that's being brought is culture and heritage, Section 106 work, having tribal members who know their land base, who know how to identify unique features on the landscape and work in partnership with archaeologists, culture and heritage staff, contracted archaeologists, to try to increase that effort to move through Section 106 work in an equitable way, and not just checking the box in a respectful way, and building that capacity as a third-party NEPA partner with the Forest Service has been really an added value as well. I think we might have one more slide and then we're done.
Well, I have one more thing to say on that past one. We call this crew our PhDs with chainsaws. And so they're the ones that are carrying out the prescriptions, and they're really, really nimble in the woods and very experienced. Some of these crew members have been with Lomacatsi full time for over 20 years now. So you're looking at a seasoned crew. We call them the A team, but yes, they are our PhDs with chainsaws.
Thank you, Margo and
Next.
Belinda. Oh.
Thank you. I think we've covered increasing Indigenous fire knowledge that's happening on a day-to-day. Thank you for the opportunity. And through the Intertribal Ecosystem Restoration Partnership, we're able to bring together many tribal interests and support our partners in the Forest Service.
Thank you both. I always enjoy hearing about your work. You do such great stuff. I'm going to turn this over to our participants. Who has questions for either the SWRI team or our guests today? I'll give it maybe let's say a minute or so to put your questions in the chat. But I'd also like to hear, maybe while folks are thinking, just quickly, just whatever first comes to your mind. We can start with Eitan and then go to Belinda and Marco. But when you first got your results, what was one thing that really stood out to you with your assessment?
Yeah, thanks, Sally. I think you told me to go first, right? So I think I was focusing on, well, one, so just about a year ago, Nikki presented at the collaborative meeting, and over Zoom, and the connection was a little wonky, but I'm so sorry, Nikki. But I think what stood out for me was I immediately started going into the small slivers where there wasn't a ton of agreement. And I was like, oh my God, who said this? Or I was focusing on like, we didn't get enough respondents. Like, if only we got more respondents, it would have been stronger. But then, as over the course of like Nikki's presentation and digesting it, seeing that like there were those big chunks of blue pretty consistently, was something that I was like, like if you look at the big picture, like there's a lot of like people strongly, or I can't remember the categories, but a lot of blue chunks showing, pretty consistent agreement, 60 to 75% of the time people were agreeing. And so I took that as a general win. And I kind of looking back on it now, I think, more respondents, but I'm really excited about the kind of the long-term ability of this tool to kind of give feedback.
That's great. Thank you. Marco and Belinda, what was just an initial reaction?
Yeah, and again, I apologize. Sometimes we're not tuned in to all the reports that are coming our way. One of the things that I would say, though, is especially for the tribal engagement part of it and the tribal inclusion, that I would just elevate that. And I would elevate also that the tribes aren't just underrepresented or underserved people, that they really are tribal nations, sovereign tribal nations, and the Forest Service and the federal agencies have a federal trust responsibility. And I don't believe that that is really truly being addressed in all of the questions that we have right now. And I think we need to continue to elevate that in consideration of the Joint Secretarial Order 3403, Executive Order 13175, and the mandates that we have right now to work with tribal nations.
That leads us right into Gary's question. How have you been able to protect tribal sacred sites and cultural resources in the CFLRP process?
By having tribal people on the ground. It's really important for us at Lomacatsi to walk the walk. We have the Northwest Forest Workers Program, Latinx workers, Latino workers, and also our tribal workers from the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde, Confederated Tribes of Siletz, the Cow Creek Band of the Umpqua Tribe of Indians. And wherever Lomacatsi goes, we hire the tribal members of that community to be in the driver's seat of how we work and treat the land. So also we're doing Section 106 in a project down on the Modoc National Forest where our tribal people are out there and doing the cultural monitoring. So being able to include them in the budgets for cultural monitoring and for the implementation of the work, we make sure they have their certification of cultural monitors so that when they're out there, they can recognize those sacred sites, the rocks, the grandmother stones that are all over the place that we still walk on, the blood and the bones of our ancestors. They know and understand that. So I would say that having tribal people out there trained in cultural monitoring and the people that know the land best is one of the better ways to protect those sacred sites.
Thanks, Belinda. Do others have questions from either the presentation earlier or from our reflections on the ground? And that's okay if you don't. I think there's a lot of information to process today. I think I'm gonna ask Jane to pull the word cloud back up if there aren't any more questions. And I'd like to see if some of the words that you came up with earlier still resonate, or if anyone would like to add some words to that word cloud after today's presentation.
That sounds great, Sally. I have a question. I think it's pretty broad, and I think it does connect to the word cloud. I just put this to our panelists and to our SWERI team that implemented the assessment. I'm wondering if looking at the word cloud as a representation of what our participants are thinking, and then also hearing our on the ground stories and our SWERI recommendations. Are there things in particular that jump out to any of you as kind of like through lines or connections to make? I can start with one reflection. I think, is a pretty clear one, the SWERI recommendation of including diverse voices and making sure that you have good representation. I think that is really well represented in the story of the Rogue Basin CFLRP and the work that Marco and Belinda do, as just one example. Anything like that stick out to our panelists or to the SWERI folks?
I could jump in. I think the field trips are key. We're going to have a field trip this Friday. We just had a helicopter operation, and it can get, I won't use the word contentious, but a lot of eyebrow raising at how our commercial operations are happening, wanting to engage the community. Those field trips to see it, touch it, and engage with the implementers, timber operators, foresters, tribal members on the ground, I think really builds bridges in the community to address all of these great expressions on the slide here. So field trips are key.
Yeah, that makes sense to me, Marco. It seems like an essential tool for building that, right? The understanding, the shared goals, some of that transparency, the other things we see here.
And then just being able to take the technical components and deliver that information to our common community members in a way that they can digest and understand what our end results are and how we go from A to Z. So, thank you.
I can add a quick reflection from the SWERI perspective. And I think when we went through these findings, both within the projects and then across the projects, it highlighted that a lot of what we learned from the CFLRP is reinforcing learning that we've already done around collaboration for many years. So a lot of the same themes we've seen from social science research and other evaluations in collaboration continue to be important in this case as well. And so just reiterates that these words align well with a lot of the findings and recommendations. So really just kind of continuing to build this body of knowledge that emphasizes the importance of relationships, importance of being on the ground and in person, the importance of communication. And so I think just noting that a lot of what we found in this evaluation just continues to reinforce some of previous work in this space as well.
Yeah, I would really encourage to, I know I'm aging myself. However, actually calling out the public laws, the laws and the mandates that we look to in order to implement the CFLRP. I know that sometimes gets lost, and keeping the integrity of the law of what CFLRP was set up to do, I think is really important. I've had to come back to that many times in partnership meetings from the beginning to today of what is the letter of the law and how do we get on the same page with the letter of the law. This is good, feel good stuff. This is community engagement. This is all the work that we love to do. However, keeping the integrity of what CFLRP was meant to do, I think is really important, and us remembering that in our talking points.
Rob, I see your hand, but could you please type your question into the chat? We have one more ahead of you. I see a quick question from Gary. Have any of the CFLRP efforts addressed issues relating to recreational activity impacts on the land, fish, and wildlife? Would anyone like to speak to that?
I can speak briefly from a kind of program perspective and let you know that we do have CFLRPs that are thinking about recreational impacts, and they are focused primarily on, making sure that there is access that is sustainable while thinking about the ecosystem as a whole. Recreation isn't a specific thing that's called out in the CFLRP legislation. So just speaking to Belinda's comment about, the purpose of the program isn't to address recreation specifically, but folks are thinking about the potential impacts from recreation and how to mitigate those while also understanding that, recreational access is one of the, purposes of our public lands, and that folks are going to continue to visit. And in many cases, we see visitation rising, right? Which is great. So balancing those things, I think, is important to many of our projects.
Yes, Sally, I can add on the recreation piece from, being, the Zuni Mountains CFLR. What I find interesting is that the 60,000 acre Ponderosa Pine Restoration EIS, and then the next 80,000 acre one to the west that was signed maybe 4 years ago now, that had a lot of, forest and watershed restoration activities, I think was less controversial than the trails expansion EA that happened in that landscape, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago. I think that a lot of people were on board with, forest restoration. The trail expansion, I think it was controversial because of kind of a little bit of NIMBY not wanting to have more recreation, people coming as a destination place. And then I think there was just a lot of cultural connections to expanding trails or some conflict, over expanding trails on ridge lines that were sacred, and so there was some navigation that needed to happen there to kind of reroute some of those proposed things in the EA. And that, I think what that shows to me is that the landscape really is sacred to many different peoples, and recreation is a serious business. And, you have to take it seriously and, invest early.
Thanks, Eitan. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers, our presenters. Rob, thank you for your comment. There is no single right answer on how to navigate so many of these questions and so much of this work. I think that's a really important point, and thank you for your appreciation and acknowledgement here. I'm going to pass it to Bryce for any last minute announcements and to wrap up, and then we will adjourn shortly.
Yeah, I just also want to express appreciation to our SWRI partners for all of their work and putting together a great, concise presentation of, I know, just extensive, interesting information that you collected through that assessment. So thanks for putting that together. And also to Belinda and Marco and Aton, who are, working on the ground with CFLRP and sharing your stories. And then, of course, also many thanks to the participants and your thoughtful engagement, questions, comments in the chat. We really appreciate your participation. So we're looking forward to continuing this series, and we'll be sending you announcements. So look for those.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.